Let me start by saying my name is Mark Sandberg. I'm the faculty director for the Nordic Center at UC Berkeley, and I'm also a professor emeritus in the Department of Scandinavian and the Department of Film and Media. Welcome to the Nordic California Food Symposium. We've got people registered from a wide variety of sources for this audience. There's some who will be interested in restaurant entrepreneurship. There will be some who are interested in best practices and the future of food and food systems. For others, it might be an interest in Nordic culture itself or in the comparison between California cuisine and the new Nordic cuisine movements. We chose as a somewhat arbitrary framework for our reflections as the observation that there are two iconic California cuisine restaurants, Chez Panisse and the French Laundry, which were both founded in the 1970s, roughly 50 years ago. So there's a perspective that comes with that. These were highly influential in their chef-driven models that emphasized locally sourced seasonal produce. Similarly, it has been roughly 20 years since the New Nordic Cuisine Manifesto was written by Klaus Meyer in consultation with other Nordic chefs in 2004. So that outline follows similar principles of locality and seasonality, and there too, there was an iconic restaurant, Noma in Copenhagen, that came to stand in for this new exemplar, or this exemplar of new Nordic cuisine. So in organizing this symposium, we were interested in the historical influences between these two approaches to food in California, especially Northern California, and in the Nordic region. But as the ideas have developed over the last 50 years, I think it's fair to say that the concentration on fine dining in the original movements has become less important than a growing attention to food systems, food access, and sustainability. With our juxtaposition of the Nordic region and California in this symposium, we want to think more broadly about the future of food and how ideas and practices that developed in both places might inform thinking that goes beyond the socioeconomically loaded term cuisine with a capital C. So we hope you come away from this with new ways of considering food, your relationship to food, and its possibilities. To that end, several of the presenters will be dealing with the tension between what we might call food locality, that is place-based thinking about food systems and sustainability, and what happens when food travels outside its original cultural context. This tension shows up in terms of terminology, translation, equivalencies, etc. And if ideas about food in California were inspirational to Nordic chefs, for example, even given the disparity in the climate and agricultural systems between the two places, it's clear that an adaptive and curious spirit was at work. Paul Svensson mentioned to me last night that Alice Waters has been living rent-free in his head for about 50 years, and there's something about that we're interested in exploring here. So we'll be teasing out these questions of access, adaptation, and place in the comparison of the California and Nordic cuisines. As an overview of today's program, I can say we'll be hearing from our keynote speaker, Paul Svensson, and his collaborator, Ruth Osborne, about the idea of a regenerative restaurant. As the day progresses, we'll also have sessions from two local restaurant entrepreneurs with different takes on presenting Nordic food to a California public. Another session will compare coffee cultures in Sweden and California. And a final one will think through the distinction between everyday food and dining. So there's a rich program on store today. I feel like it's important to start by saying that given that we will be thinking about land, food, and place today, it's very important to acknowledge the deeper history of the place in which we are meeting. UC Berkeley sits on the territory of Huichin, the original landscape of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. The Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this unceded land since the institution's founding in 1868. We recognize that the Muwekma Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities today. Tomorrow we'll be shining a spotlight on that issue in a session about Indigenous foods and the inspiration they provide. We thank all of our presenters for making the effort to travel to be here with us today, some from nearby, others from elsewhere in the US, and of course some also making the very, very long trip from the Nordic region to California. We like to say that there's a kind of close affinity between the places, but the physical proximity is not as close. I also want to thank upfront the administrative support staff for what has turned out to be a very ambitious multi-day program that coordinates both food and intellectual content in a tight curation. The staff of the Center for Responsible Business has carried the brunt of this planning in an admirably professional manner. Natalie America Munoz, Persis Spurlow, and Amber Van Meter. These are names that will be familiar to our participants from email, but they have shown amazing organizational skills and grace under pressure, so we're very grateful to them for their contributions. In the earlier investigative phase of the planning, Chandani Dialani, who is also part of the research team for the Scandinavian Flavor Networks project that we'll hear from tomorrow. Chandani just walked in. She was very helpful in helping me do background research and original conceptualization of the program, so thank you, Chandani. And we also have undergraduate student workers helping us on each of these 2 days, Sophia Valencia, Stephanie Lord, and Hadley, I'm not sure if they're here right now. I should also thank for the essential sponsorship the Barbara Osher Proswecia Foundation for their ongoing support of the Nordic Center and more generally and specifically for this symposium. We have also received support from the Swedish Consulate General of San Francisco. We will be tasting as well as listening today, so I'll remind everybody just in a bit of housekeeping here at the beginning that Chu Hall and this event location aspires to a zero waste policy, so we encourage you to be diligent in your sorting of compostables and recyclables. Our goal is not to throw anything into the waste stream as a result of this symposium. Okay, so let me turn now to the introduction of Chef Paul Svensson and Ruth Osborne, who will be joining the latter part of the presentation. Paul Svensson is a Swedish chef, restaurateur, and creative director based in Stockholm, internationally recognized for his pioneering work in sustainable gastronomy. After beginning his career as chef de partie in the Swedish Royal Navy, he refined his craft in London under Marco Pierre White at the Michelin-starred Quo Vadis, and later in Stockholm at Bon Loc, where he served as head chef and earned a Michelin star. Representing Sweden at the Bocuse d'Or in 2003, Paul placed 5th, an achievement that helped establish him as one of Sweden's most influential chefs. He went on to lead acclaimed kitchens such as Fredsgatan 12, and later founded Paul's Kitchen, a consultancy focused on culinary creativity and sustainable innovation. As creative director at Fotografiska, the restaurant at the Photographic Museum in Stockholm, Paul introduced a pioneering plant-forward and zero-waste food philosophy, earning awards including Best Restaurant in Stockholm and Best Museum Restaurant in the World. I love that category. Alongside a much-coveted green Michelin star. He has since launched the Retaste initiative that repurposes food waste into new meals, and Paul Taylor Lanthandel, dedicated to circular and upcycled food systems. Today, Paul is the creative director for food and agriculture at Rosendals Trädgård, out on Djurgården in Stockholm, where he's developing a regenerative model that unites soil health, biodiversity, and circular food production with culinary creativity. In recognition of his influence on sustainable food culture, Paul was named an honorary doctor at Örebro University and continues to inspire a global movement towards delicious, responsible, and future-proof food. I like that combination. Ruth Osborne, his collaborator, is a dynamic hospitality and sustainability leader with over 20 years of global experience shaping purpose-driven food and beverage projects. She's currently the Director of Hospitality and ESG at Pillar Wellbeing and co-founder of the Cordia Collective. She has worked across the UK, Sweden, and beyond to create restaurants, events, and initiatives that champion creativity, community, and environmental impact. I will turn the time over to Paul to begin, and there will be an interactive component of this presentation that Ruth will help lead us through at the end. So please join me in welcoming Paul.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Are we good? I can start by introducing myself while we are getting the hang of the technique. All right. I'm super honored to be here. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. It was amazing. You get embarrassed almost. You realize that I've kept myself busy for quite some time, and I'm really happy to be here to talk about our passion. Me and Ruth has been practicing this ideas for the last 7 years, but we actually got a divorce a year ago, but we're back on track. So, and Mark, you're the reason for this. No, actually, this is it's a good start for us to get back together on the road as a tour, but also to reconnect in a way how we can actually emphasize the things we've found out during the way, sort of. I'm gonna try to explain what a journey is coming out of sort of, you know, the Michelin star restaurant perspective, and now being I picked up a hitchhiker just a few months ago in Stockholm, and she defined me as the chef that is cooking with garbage nowadays. And that's a shift, because coming out of course, the Michelin star restaurant is all about the opposite, really. It's been sort of a quality, of course, and technique-orientated way of looking at gastronomy, and I think that's the biggest shift for me nowadays, that we're interested in the whole perspective of why a restaurant actually exists. And we've been focusing on, sort of in a way, how we can actually reduce our footprint in so many ways, but also being connected to the ecosystem. And mainly been focusing on sort of the place-based, of course, the local perspective of it, but also the last few years we've become really interested in how we are connected to the global system. And this was it was a professor in Sweden that actually presented a study 10 years ago, which was called the 2,000 square meters. And this idea of an equal share of arable land all over the world could look like this in a way. So starting by looking at what actually is the preference of creating a restaurant, and how much resources are you taking on, and what kind of resources is there to take on. So this is simple math, really. It's about the amount of arable land we have on Earth, and it's about 40 million square kilometers. And that divided with 8 billion people gives us all in here 2,000 square meters each to work on, sort of, you know, like a yearly basis. This is what I can create out of. And 2,000 square meters is like a normal, at least in Sweden, it's a normal space for a villa. So it's your home, really, that you need to take care of your space. And those 2,000 square meters needs to be run in a regenerative way, of course, because otherwise you're going to lose values, mainly nutrients, during the year, and it's going to be decreased over years. So you need to learn how to work those 2,000 square meters in a regenerative way. But it also means there is like a certain proportion in between plants, of course, and animals. And mainly to run the 2,000 square meters, you need 0.1 cow. So that's the back of the cow you can see as a preference. That means not a lot of meat, of course. So if you look at it out of a yearly perspective, that leaves you with between 5 to 7 kilos of meat or beef. But it also is very relevant out of the perspective of manure, because you need the actual manure to run a regenerative farm. And that leaves you with about 624 kilos of compost, really. But it also leaves you with some milk. And the interesting picture about this is that it gives you sort of a math to calculate sort of what you are using in a restaurant and why you're using it. Because normally you think there's enough, you could just use wherever, and you can create a menu out of, the perspective of creativity at that point, because, you don't calculate how much milk there is for you to use. But this actual math model could calculate like what a hotel actually needs. How many customers do we have? And we did this, me and Ruth, actually. We opened up a restaurant together with a gardener, just to do like a proof of concept. So we said that, okay, so this needs to provide us with 1,095 meals, because that's 3 meals a day for one person in a year. So that leaves us with 1,095 guests. So we're going to open up this restaurant, and we're going to provide 1,095 seats and see if it works out. So this gardener got the lovely project of growing 2,000 square meters out of a regenerative way of thinking. That leaves you with 7 shifts. So 3 shifts of lay for the animals and then 4 shifts of goods. But it also leaves you with a perspective of perennials, because, to put, let's say we have a sweetheart cabbage and you compare that to kale, it takes on different amount of surface or soil surface, sort of in a way. So it also you start thinking about what kind of products are we actually going to grow out of an efficiency perspective. And that leaves you with a lot of ideas, of course, because some of the plants are taking on a lot of space. Let's say oil, for an example. So if you need at least 3 liters of cold-pressed rapeseed oil as out of a health perspective for a year, but that takes on 120 square meters of soil. And it also is sort of allocating that space from autumn all the way through season, and the harvest is in the end of the season, and then you only harvest the seeds. So it's a very unpractical crop in a way, because it only leaves you with some seeds, which is actually not all oil. So that leaves you with a cake of fibers, which actually is quite bitter. So then suddenly that becomes relevant. Could you actually eat that kind of bitter cake out of the rapeseed production? And that became sort of a project on its own in Lund at the university, and how you could actually, reduce the bitterness out of the cake so you can actually use 100% of the seeds. So this has become more or less like a task of not wasting anything, because 2,000 square meters is not big. It's quite small, actually. But it could provide you with 1,500 portions of decent meals if you work with it really well. And as you introduced, Mark, it's all about not wasting anything, really, but it's not also a different way of not considering stuff as waste, because we consider it waste when we don't have an idea of what to do with it. So this became also a very important task by doing this and realizing that there is no possibility of wasting anything. And at this point, we are wasting 1/3 of everything that we produce in Sweden. And it's the amount of, or equivalent to the size of Sörmland, which is a very productive area in Sweden. And it's a beautiful area which has an enormous biodiversity of great food. But we are wasting that arable land every year. And I think the equivalent in the States is half of Texas, the amount of arable land that we waste. So it's interesting because we are wasting it in so many different ways, of course. We're wasting it because we don't know what to do with it. We're also wasting it because we have an overproduction, and we waste it because we don't find it respectfully enough worthy to be eaten sometimes, if it's a leftover or whatever that could be. But all these findings has also sort of been a starting point for us, at least, to look at gastronomy in a totally different way. So when we start calculating a restaurant, we start calculating totally different nowadays. But it's not only those 2,000 square meters, and this is where the place-based kitchen actually comes in. There is additionals or additions to these 2,000 square meters. And of course we have the foraging perspective. Wherever you are, and actually is probably where every single gastronomy perspective comes out of, what the actual nature can provide that is not agriculture, that actually is there already, that we consider like for free. But it's there, but we don't consider it worthy enough to pick it anymore. And one example in Sweden, at least, is lingonberries, which is a very lovely berry, but the statistics says last year we picked about 5% of all the lingonberries. So we waste 95% out of what the actual storage in the forest could provide us with. And that's so many different kinds of products that is wasted in the same way, and I'm going to try to explain why. But it also is sustainable water, which is more or less not so sustainable anymore, but there is sustainable water production of products. We're working really closely with a circular farm down in the south of Sweden, which is called farmed fish, or gårdsfisk in Swedish, which is a circular farm which actually is providing sort of vegetarian fish. So they can actually calculate the same way as we did with 2,000 square meters. So if you grow 1 kilo of vegetables, this is a vegetarian fish, it actually comes out like 1 kilo of fish. So then the math becomes easy. So you can actually calculate that into those 2,000 square meters. So let's say I grow grains. I give 1 kilo of grain to the fish. I get 1 kilo of fish as a result. And that becomes easy then to see what the proportion actually could be in between fish and food and grown food, and of course the wild perspective of these additions as well. And then we have food tech, which probably not going to solve the issue of saving the world's population, but it's an additional. And looking at it, there's some really good stuff coming out of food tech as well. And one of the first sort of intersection, for me at least, was here in San Francisco, and it's a really good story actually that gave me the ideas of what we are practicing nowadays. And I got to see some really good people at Hamptons Creek here in San Francisco when they started their Just Mayo production. That was in an early stage, but the interesting part about it was he told me, like, it was such a good story, because he said, like, okay, so Paul, have you had a hamburger? I was like, yeah, of course I've had a hamburger. So when you are standing there with a hamburger in your face and you're having the first bite, do you actually consider what the egg tastes like in the mayonnaise? And you don't, because it's just a technical profile that you can combine oil with egg yolks and that becomes a mayonnaise. But there's so many different ways of doing it, probably better, and that's what we call tech today. It's like looking at different perspective of creating the same thing in a more responsible way with less resources being used. And this is what they did. They did this amazing mayonnaise, which has actually been on the market for quite some time, but nobody consider it a sustainable product. They consider it something you eat when you don't eat eggs. But we're way past that nowadays. It's like techniques. It's about being curious about what the actual product could provide you with. And I normally talk about broad beans because I find it really interesting, because we don't have avocado. I love avocado. I've had it every day since I came here, but we don't grow any avocados in Sweden. But the funny part about it is, like, everyone is craving for avocados in Sweden. But we have broad beans, and in a certain stage, when you actually are using the whole the whole bean, and you are sort of slowly cooked it, and you blend it, and you pass it, and it comes out exactly the same way, the same color, the same nuttiness, the same fattiness, because it actually contains fattiness to preserve the actual seed inside the pod. And if you add the actual leaf of the broad bean, then you have an intense flavor to be served as well. And the interesting part about it, that's sort of a place-based perspective of being sort of inspired by a totally different place, but you could do the same by just looking at the potential of something actually being efficiently grown where I live, and could produce the same sort of experience which people are looking for. And of course, this is sort of the framework where we work today, and how we actually start creating, looking at a system in a way, so we don't end up doing every single dish with sort of a milk product. So it's also a good example. If you look at one liter of milk, for an example, and you're craving for cheese, then suddenly that leaves you with, of course, 100 grams of cheese, but it leaves you with 9 deciliters or 90% of whey. But whey is not like a product. It's a fraction, and it's a problem. It's probably wasted most of the time all over the livestock farms in Sweden, because we don't look at it as a direct product. We look at it as a by-stream, like a totally different product that actually is not used in everyday cooking. But whey is a beautiful product. Everyone knows that, been trying it. For an example, like if you are in the ice cream business, then suddenly whey is the perfect sort of emulsifier. It gives a beautiful texture. It has a lightness, which gives it almost like a sorbet structure, instead of using the actual milk. But at the same time, when I go to the store, realizing I love butter and I realize I love cheese, I don't consider buying low-fat milk, because it's not on my radar. But that's the actual fact of it. Like, if you want to have cheese and if you want to have like really good butter, then you need to be interested in low-fat products, because that's what you get left with if you're really interested in preserving that way. So that gives you a totally different way of looking at, you know, the diversity of the dishes you're going to present at the restaurant. So not all of them can contain a high-fat sort of profile. Some of them, or 90% of the product, needs to contain low-fat profiles. But it also gives you a perspective of health, because it's not good to have, of course, high-fat products in every single dish if you have a tasting menu. So that gives you a health perspective also how to create. But anyhow, mainly when you work in a Guide Michelin restaurant, you keep yourself over there, you know, by the FAM. FAM is it's the sort of framework which actually Guide Michelin is working with as a judgment profile for a restaurant. So of course they're really interested in the room. What's it like? What kind of meeting do we actually, or what kind of hospitality experience are we actually providing? And of course what kind of product is presented. These three together with a management sort of control system creates an atmosphere which we get judged by. And this is the normal profile of walking into a restaurant. But this is also sort of, in a way, old school. Because if we want to continue developing the restaurant business, we need to look at sort of the profile that actually is creating the framework to be a restaurant. And this is where we started, me and Annika Jan Rodell. She's a lovely woman at Örebro University, which I'm working really closely with. We have this beautiful group of students every autumn, which we have been sort of trying this framework on, and it has become sort of a tool. We call it a tool nowadays. And we call it the HEPEC tool because it is sort of the complete experience. Because the actual gastronomy university has mainly been focusing on the FAM sort of perspective of creating really, really good whole experiences of a restaurant. But actually we've moved over here sort of as a project to get the students to realize that food or, you know, restaurant experience is actually starts somewhere else, to create like the full storytelling experience. So HEPEC has become sort of a short version for history, ecosystem, primary producers, entrepreneurs, and circular systems. I'm going to try to walk you through this actual tool because it really is a research tool in a way. And it works on a really small place, it works on a nation, it works on a global perspective. It's your choice which perspective you choose to make. I'm going to choose a small space to give you sort of a perspective of how we work with the tool. And this is a small space in Sweden. It's Dalarna. It's in central Sweden, and it's bordered to Norway. And the population is not that big. I mean, it's a normal city somewhere, but this is the whole region. But it's also a really beautiful region because it has a beautiful history. So let's talk about history, because, I mean, most of the stuff that we create today is coming out of some sort of history perspective. And it's not the history of food, really, it's the history of the place. The history of a place has so much to tell, but it also has so much to tell about the nature of that place, what the possibilities are, and the possibility that actually were, and how things has changed since, beginning of times. So this is a beautiful area which is nowadays very much known for a beautiful cross-country race, which I do every year, Vasaloppet. So I go there, but I also love this place because it has so much to tell about what we actually could achieve out of a Swedish perspective. But it also is very sort of inspirational, I think, when you look at it from the outside. And it has a lot to say about heritage. It has so many heritage products coming out of this place, especially heritage grains. It also has a very sort of sustainable, responsible way of looking at forestry, and it has Gustav Vasa, of course, because he is a profile, but it has sort of a royal glow to it because all the traditions are coming out of there. Most of the midsummer traditions is from there, so there's so many sort of occasions that we are related to when we talk about Dalarna. But there was also woodcraft, and the traditional home economy was sort of founded there, but also quite close to Örebro, where there's someone called Kaj Savai, which did this book like ages ago, which is about home economy, but also about preserving and taking care of what the actual storage has to offer, like the forest, for an example. So that leaves you with something to start with, like how are we going to actually emphasize this into becoming further down a beautiful meal? Yeah, we need to look at the system, both ecosystem, both out of a social perspective, but mainly, of course, an ecological perspective. And there's a perspective of Talco. This is actually stolen from Finland, but it's a way of getting together and making things happen unpaid, sort of. And it's a beautiful sort of social context that we would like everyone to get inspired by, at least in Sweden, because it has a lot to say about how we move forward together. And Talco is a really beautiful way of doing that. And of course, it contains fresh water, it has streams, it has lakes, it has a variety of growth zones, which is actually the best part in Sweden, I would say. It has between 3 and 8. That makes a big biodiversity of products, actually, inside this frame of Dalarna. And it contains a lot of forest, but it also contains a lot of pasture. So it has almost everything, this space, really. But also, I mean, with the possibilities, that also gives you a lot of loopholes to cover, or gaps, sort of. The primary production is mainly a grass-fed product, like grass-fed beef, of course, but also grass-fed milk, which has become sort of a profile, because that's not always common in Sweden. So it's interesting now that you can get hold of like grass-fed butter, you can get hold of grass-fed milk. So that has become a new profile of a more sort of sustainable, ecosystem-connected product in a way. But also eggs and heritage rye and wheat, and a lot of forest crops coming out of this. The entrepreneurs in this area, which is also sort of an important part, because you are part of a system, even though you don't realize it until you do this research. You realize that there's a lot of people already working here, producing stuff, preserving things, or just, being part of a total system. And I just choose a few to make an example. There's some really good ice cream makers. Crisp bread is a huge area in this area, and also connected very much to the agriculture. So they are focusing, because there's some big companies producing hard bread and providing the rest of the world, actually, with this kind of hard breads. There's some cheesemongers, cheese production, and there's some forestry companies and a lot of foragers, of course. So where does that leave me? That's the interesting question here, because I'm going to be part of this system, and by doing this research, getting me all the way here, and sort of, forcing this into becoming either a product or maybe a restaurant or just something that actually closes some gaps in the system leaves you probably with a dish. And this is the actual quest, I mean, for the students every autumn. They need to provide me and Annika with a dish that actually is sort of taking all these aspects in. And this would be the dish which is actually served at Studio 2000, which we did. So it's an example of what it could look like. And it's also not by just looking at what the actual product could be out of what the heritage says. It's also about what they can't sell. So by being part of the system, you realize like rye is a very delicate product. And rye is not all good. I mean, it depends on what kind of season it is, of course. And I just learned a new word, actually, because Ruth told me about it. It's called the Hagberg rated in Sweden, or like the correct translation would be the low falling number value of rye. Needs to be a very precise number to be able to be hard bread. Otherwise, it ends up as fodder, and then you get half paid. So it's also about looking at the financial perspective of being part of the system. So how can I actually raise this farmer to be more resilient by creating something out of what normally don't sell? So this is a waffle that we made out of low falling number value rye into a sourdough, which you can do this beautiful waffle straight out of the sourdough. So you don't need any additionals to this. But also we probably raised the amount of lingonberries that was picked this year or that year from 5% to 5.0002 maybe. But, I mean, every single thing counts, sort of in a way. But also the same perspective of wheat, of course, with a low falling number value. So we did this waffle, but also we realized when you're in the forestry industry, you're mainly in it for the trees, of course, and the woodcraft. And we need paper. We need something to write on, of course. But in this sort of, process, you get left with something beautiful called burst sugar. It's the actual foam of the paper production, which is actually a beautiful non-calorie sugar, which is super healthy, but also has sort of a fizziness, a coldness to it, which is really adaptable to desserts. So then suddenly we are moving straight out of beet sugar, which is taking on a lot of surface of those 2,000 square meters, moving over to birch sugar, which actually is creating this dish in a much better version. It becomes cooler, becomes tastier, lighter, and then we do it out of whey, of course, instead of milk, because we know for sure that we're gonna help this livestock owner by creating a whey ice cream, which is going to be really popular on the market, served with, of course, some flavor from this area, which is spruce. There's a lot of spruce in this area, and this dish on its own is also served on recycled glass made into a waffle. So, I mean, it's all about the total experience. It's not about the food. It's about what the story it could tell by doing this research all the way down to a waffle and opening up a waffle place in this area, which people already love. It's also about looking at the social context. You don't need to reinvent stuff. You just need to develop it, and then suddenly you have a product that actually is closing a lot of circular systems by just existing in a restaurant. So I would say HIPIC is the new best practice of having sort of a research trip to do a certain kind of restaurant. And this is something that has emphasized and inspired me for so many years now, and it's also a good friend of both me and Ruth. And it's Dan Barber. He has this amazing place, Stone Barns, on the other coasts. And they are working this way, and they are mainly focusing on what kind of products are we going to actually grow to grow a restaurant into becoming more regenerative. And that's what I do as well as my daily basis operation in Stockholm in the middle of Djurgården. So this is just sort of an example of how this tool could actually work, but it also says that it doesn't mean it needs to be like a really, really tiny place. It could also be the whole of the States. It could be the global perspective. It just depends on where you start, what kind of history you're looking for. And I mean, I've been very much intrigued and inspired by the native way of looking at it. And one of the first products that actually came to my mind when I was going to do this lecture was this amazing wheat that I got to see at a beautiful restaurant here in San Francisco, which used to call Perennials. It doesn't exist anymore. But they had this beautiful picture of the root work. It was like 5 meters of roots coming out of it, and then you could see like the traditional wheat that we normally grow now is like really tiny, and it's of course connected to the surface, which is not resilient to changing weathers and all that sort of stuff. But also realizing when I saw it, we started a project in Sweden to grow this specific Native American wheat. And it's super tasty, but it's totally different to the wheat we're used to. So then we need to reimagine what wheat is and what we should use wheat for. So it doesn't need to be baking goods all the time. Maybe we should just eat the wheat, because it's like super nutrient, it's really tasty, it has a depth of flavor, and it gives you sort of a new perspective of cooking as well. So it's a new drive for me, at least, to find products like this coming out of history that could be the modern version of something totally different in my restaurants. So health is actually flavor. And I've known this, I've probably second-guessed it for quite many years, but I've read a book recently, and I got to know this beautiful man, Franco Rubini, which has an amazing company called Natura, and he gave me this book, and just realizing that actually working backwards in gastronomy is the reasonable way of doing it, because you know for sure that to be the best restaurant in the world, you need to be serving up the best flavors. So where does actually flavor come from, and working yourself backwards and realizing that if it is healthy for a human being, if it's healthy for the soil, it is probably healthy out of a gastronomy perspective as well, because you are working with the most flavor intense product there is if you work with the soil. And that's good for the planet and the society, of course. Okay, I'm totally up for you now, Ruth. Bring it on. So we wanted to use this study or this tool sort of in a way to interact with you guys. So she's the technical part of this team. So
that
she'll
is
probably,
so optimistic.
I'll leave it to her, actually. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to meet you all. I hope to talk to you all over coffee later. As Paul said, my name's Ruth. So what we thought we would do now, we've done half an hour of Paul educating us and talking to us. And we thought we'd try and make this a bit more interactive and talk about how to apply this HEPEC concept. So we've travelled many times around the world. We had the privilege of working for the Swedish embassies. And the picture here on the screen is from a trip we did to Colombia. And Paul and I arrived in Bogota, jet-lagged, very excited, with no idea what we were going to do. We are cooking for 300 people at the Swedish embassy for midsummer. Cool. Yeah. No pickled herring here. So what I realised on that trip, talking to a wonderful chef that we partnered with who took us everywhere, farms, restaurants, bars, we saw it all, was that you have to go into this process with curiosity. The key to being future thinking is asking questions. You need to be open to innovation, and you need to talk to the community. So today, you're our community. Have you all participated in Slido before? Those of you who don't have data, there is good Wi-Fi, so please do join in. What we're going to do, because Paul and I know nothing about the Bay Area, and we're really keen to learn, so we thought we would go through the HEPEC process with you guys, and at the end of it, Paul's going to make a dish of the flavour of the Bay.
Good luck.
Cheers, Chef. Yeah. Take some notes. I'm going to give you a couple more secs just to do this. What I'm doing it is with one, I think they call it a cloud. So I will ask some questions and you guys can just throw ideas. It's completely anonymous. You can write as many times as you like. The more answers we get, the more interesting it is, so please go for it. And then if two of you say one answer, it gets bigger, so we can see the ideas that are more communally shared, and then the more sort of random ideas. And yeah, Paul, you're going to have to either take notes or...
I'll take some notes.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Are we ready to start? So, H in HEPEC is for history. And so we need to know about the people of the Bay Area, the traditions of the Bay Area, the heritage that you guys have here, and what flavours you think are integral to this space. It can be anything you like. It can be from last week. It can be from 300 years ago. Maya lemons, yes. Is it Maya or Maya? Maya, thank you, just before I mispronounce it constantly. Oh, blackberry. Yeah, we learnt about huckleberries last night, which I'm guessing might pine. There's some familiarity for you, Chef. Sourdough, there's some familiar thing. Oh, crab. This is great. Look at all these flavours. Fresh, fresh, fresh. I love that. This is very California cuisine, isn't it? But it really is ringing true with Swedish as well. I don't think anyone has said the same thing here. Oh, there we go. Three Sisters crops. Correct me if I'm wrong. This is interactive. Please shout out. Is that the bean, pumpkin, corn growing together? Or is that something else?
Never heard the expression. Actually.
I thought Three Sisters was when it all grows in collaboration. Is it? Yeah, exactly. It's when the beans grow up the corn and the pumpkins grow at the bottom, and they all kind of feed one another.
Okay, beautiful.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Okay, so sourdough, Three Sisters, Alice Walters, she lives in your brain already, so that's perfect.
Rent-free.
Yeah, rent-free, I love that. Perfect. Okay, great. So there's loads of inspiration there. We've got the historical perspective of traditions with the Ohlone people. We've got fresh. Is there any Wild West entrepreneurs? I love that. Surf, oysters. Okay, great. So that gives us so much to work with as a stage one. We are going to move on. Oh, someone's still typing. Perfect, I've just seen that. Spanish missions.
Really cool.
That's really cool, yeah.
This is the quick version of this study, actually.
So you can take this back to the university. There you go, this is the new way to do it with the students from here on in. Gold Rush hippies. Oh, I love it. That's why I fit right in. I'm enjoying it. The Gold Rush hippie. Perfect, that's really useful. If we go from here and we move on to entrepreneur, ecosystem, apologies. So we need the key elements of the ecosystem that we have here, thinking about what the climate's like, what the soil quality's like, what you use the land for, what industries there are. There seems to be fog. Is the fog called Carl, I learnt this morning. I love that. What immigrant communities you have that bring energy and flavour to the ecosystem here, what the political situation is here, careful, and yeah, the community that you live in and how that influences the ecosystem. Swedish American. 2 seasons. What's 2 seasons? Does that mean do you have a hot and a wet or a hot and a cold? Dry and wet. Poetry. Okay, that's a challenge for you when writing a dish, Chef.
What? Poetry?
You have to do it in poetry form, a haiku. Coastal forest. There is a lot of parallels here between the Nordics and...
absolutely.
It's great. Low water, Carl the Fog, there you go, I knew it had a name. Food really, really matters. I love that. Mexican. Oh, we had some great Mexican the other night, yep. Hills and valleys. What's the quality of the soil here? Is there something that you grow a lot of historically around here? Avocados, lemons, I guess what we listed before. And seawater. Clay. There you go, clay for the plates. Which one is how do I pronounce that? Sequoia tree?
Sequoia.
Sequoia?
Redwood.
Oh, okay. Are they the really enormous ones?
Very, very enormous, and on top of that, they take in water not merely from their roots, but from their leaves.
Oh, interesting.
Not this, whatever you call
The piney things. We were commenting on the walk here how interesting it is because the plant life is entirely different. Like it is a completely different ecosystem. It's amazing.
interesting about this is that Silicon Valley was known as Valley of Heart's Delight because of such agriculture, but especially fruit.
Really?
And still to this day, that area is the leader in the U.S. for apricots.
So it still has the growing alongside the Silicon Valley development.
The problem was that for Silicon Valley, these big companies needed large properties.
Yeah.
So they bought orchards.
Oh,
And apple and IBM and others.
that feels a little sad. All right, we'll collect the last entries for you. How are you feeling about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of
You're
things to
getting
work
inspired?
with. Yeah, I get really inspired.
Okay. And then the last one is primary production. So what is being farmed or wild? What is the coming from the land or the sea? What food or beverage can we have? Also, you had forestry and things like that on your list, didn't you, Chef?
Yeah.
So it doesn't need to be literally just the vegetables and fruits, but also IPA, brilliant. Fruits, plums, pears, figs, olives. Look at that. This is such an interesting process because it's so far from what we have back at home. We're okay with the wine getting bigger and bigger.
Oh, yeah.
Seaweed. Is the seaweed wild or is there seaweed farming here in the Bay Area?
Tremendous farming.
Farming, yeah. There we go, crabberries, wine, lemon.
But we also have 2 mountain ranges here in northern California.
Yeah. Brilliant. Got what you need? Perfect. And then entrepreneurs. So this is the bit where Paul talked about the local ice cream maker or the people working with woodwork. But who are the people that work here? What are the industries and products that are being made that might have gaps? So a lot of what Paul talked about was finding the gaps, as in the whey that comes from the milk and the butter and cheese production, or the birch sugar that comes from the paper industry. So this should hopefully provide us with ideas of where there may be gaps in the system, where things are being wasted, and that we could turn that waste into a viable, delicious, hopefully, product. Dandelion chocolate. Who can tell? Is that literally made from dandelion roots? Oh, okay. I was like, wow, dandelion root chocolate. That's fascinating.
I thought you were looking for actual property.
Ah, I got you. Okay, cheese production.
You know, with that tech and AI listed there, what you could really, you could figure out ways that you can use the carbon that we're trying to take out of the air
Yeah.
from pollution and apply it to food. You would get a Nobel.
You probably will, yeah. There's some good ideas about that, though.
Matcha is good as well, though. Perfect. There is so much here to work with.
Mm-hmm.
Are you feeling
Yeah, overwhelmed.
okay? gonna stop now before Paul falls off the stage. So, this is basically, we've given you all the information. This is proof of concept 101. Given all the information and only 5 minutes rather than 6 months and a school term, what would your dish be for the Bay Area?
It would be a foggy sort of perspective of. I mean, you could create fog So it would be a fog restaurant. So you were sitting in there, there's fog everywhere, sort of as long as you can see the food. It would be served on clay plates covered in gold from the gold rush. But it also has a lot to say, because I realized yesterday, because we had some really good Spanish food, of course. The Spanish mission actually was sort of a part of this history. And this is actually a Spanish dish served here as well. But it's also a mixture of Mexican, because it's a taco to begin with, but it's also a very seasonal dish. But I realized when I saw people typing in tech and AI, it's also interesting how this actual AI could provide us with closing the gaps by looking at products which is actually not used, and not the most specific product, which would be, let's say, making a wine is sort of the search of the great liquid of the actual grape. But what can we do? What kind of products could you do out of the press situation of a wine? So that is probably the same way as an apple in Sweden, when I normally take that as an example. So there's a lot of people in the apple juice business in Sweden, and it's a beautiful product. We have so many different varieties, but nobody actually used the press of the apples. So it's also interesting, could that be, you know, a project like a mixture of the press product of all the wine production in this valley together with maybe the Native American wheat instead of corn, which is actually grown here, comes from here. Could be that taco, and that taco is the actual meat is made out of oat, which I know this area is really good at. You know, the production of plant-based sort of substitute to animal products, and then we could actually work with the milk instead. So the milk would be underneath, which is, there's a lot of dairy producers here, and we probably would do like a proper sort of dressing out of the way, instead of using maybe the citrus, which is, I mean, the Maria lemons is beautiful, but maybe we could use the whey instead of the citrus to actually make this beautiful dressing to come with the kebab. That would be my first suggestion of a dish, at least.
He'll be cooking it tonight. I'm joking.
Maybe not.
That's it. That's you.
But it's, yeah, thank you guys. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I live in Emeryville, moved in there in 82. Pixar has this giant area in Emeryville. That whole space was once their long fruit packaging, because there was too much peaches growing here, and they couldn't ship fresh peaches, so they invented canning.
Mm-hmm.
So that whole area, which is now Pixar, used to be their own fruit packaging for peaches.
Oh my
Oh,
God.
wow.
Oh, that's interesting.
And tomatoes too, actually.
And tomatoes as well.
They invented the whole canning
Ah, the whole canning situation, yeah.
fresh
Yeah,
in those days.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But the whole, next time you go by Pixar,
Yeah.
it's okay, I'm allowed it. Oh, you record it too. Wow. Should I sing a little too? I can sing. You are my sunshine. Anyway, that's quite interesting to go by Pixar right nowadays
Yeah,
and think about it when there was fruit. But
Yeah.
of course, Emeryville in those days, when we moved in '82, was nothing but bad industry, which is not a whole beautiful shopping center down there by IKEA and a little further north. There was nothing but fertilizer and paint factories, terrible,
Yeah.
which is now this fantastic little shopping center.
yeah.
And then we go by H&M down there too. It started in my hometown in Västerås in Sweden.
No, but it also, that conclusion is actually the most modern, I would say, nowadays, that we the industrialization, is that the way you say?
Yeah, industrialization.
Yeah, industrialization, whatever. It's a very long word.
We got it.
Yeah.
You did it.
Anyhow, when that came in, it was mainly to become, to make cooking more convenient, of course, and to package food. And I realized when I started as a chef, that was like a swear word to say that you were using something that is preserved. But it also is moving into becoming something totally different. And actually, Dan Barber said something really wise is that like all chefs are processing food. It's the way we process food that we need to look at, and how we can actually process in a way to keep the healthiness, but mainly to keep the flavors. And we know for sure to ferment something, like we ferment salad or we ferment cabbage, we increase the value of health, but we also increase the value of flavor. So it's also about the preserving industry moving from making it comfortable to making it flavorful is probably one of the movements we're going to see a lot of. And we're working really closely with like a small project in Sweden, how you can preserve locally as well, in a way, to keep all the products and keep 100% of the product as well for a 12-month season. If you want to stay inside the 2,000 square meters, then you need to do that.
And we'll open up here, and I would like to say hello. I am a colleague of Mark Sandberg, the faculty director of the Nordic Center. I'm Robert Strand. I have the privilege of being the executive director of the Nordic Center. I am also wearing running shoes, and I'll be running around with this microphone. And if you're willing to say your name and where you're coming from.
Astrid Olsen, I'm from San Francisco. Anyway, my question was on the HEPIC for the restaurants. Sweden having harsh winters, are they seasonal? Because, what grows in the snow?
Yeah. Yeah, they are seasonal, well, in a way, but it's also a way of sort of connecting to what kind of agriculture can actually stay in the snow. It's like I'm self-taught sort of farmer. So I farm my 2,000 square meters at home, and I'm considering crops that actually is sort of possible to leave in the soil, actually to preserve in the soil. So we have a few different kinds of beets, for an example, which is it can stand the actual frost if you cover them, and we have a lot of Jerusalem artichokes, of course. Some sorts of potatoes also can stand the freezing temperatures, but it's also about preserving. So sort of the winter season is a lot about, there's nothing wrong with the freezer as long as you use the freezer in a correct way, of course. And also changing the season, which Noma did so wisely, sort of in a way. It's also about looking at, the additionals. So, during summertime, it's all about the veggies. So it's probably a plant-based season where you eat a lot of veggies. Going into autumn, you have, of course, the game situation, but you also have the beautiful storage of the forest, which I was picking mushrooms just the other day. Got 5 kilos of mushrooms in 1 hour, and it's all for free. You put an hour in and you get all this beautiful stuff to put in your freezer. But also going into winter, of course, becomes more of an ocean situation. And as you know, Sweden is a very long country, but it's also covered with water, both inside and outside. So that's also leaving you with sort of a schedule of what you eat during the year. And Noma did it so well. It's like, okay, so we are totally going into the water situation during winter time with the additionals of what we could preserve, of course in the freezer, but also in cans or as fermented. And then walking into the spring season, we have sort of, the wild crops coming up, all the onion crops and the overwintering stuff like the Jerusalem artichokes and the beets. And then suddenly we get all the greens, like all the beautiful chlorophyll going into spring season. So, it's difficult in Sweden. Of course, I agree with that. But it is possible, but we need to be a bit more precise with what we eat. So, most of the restaurants are probably all over the world, and most chefs want to be able to choose in between all the products all the time, because otherwise they think it's too tight of a framework to be creative in. But I think that's the whole idea of competing, like for an example, because all chefs are actually very talented when someone gives them a framework. So every single competition I've been in, there's always a very tight framework. So these are the products that you need to use. You could use some additionals, but these need to be, the main products of this dish. And then suddenly you're very much aware of and very talented in doing it that way. But then when you're back at the restaurant, you suddenly want the whole storage again. So it's also about being creative with less products over time, but more products over a year. So in a way, that becomes a more biodiverse restaurant, or a diverse sort of perspective of walking into a restaurant. It never looks the same. And I think that's also a privilege to be able to provide that diversity over the year. So I really much emphasize the way Noma thinks about the way they create menus.
Also, I think our work with Studio 2000, I've never been so restricted. So I created the beverage menus to match the food from this 2,000 square meters. And we had a alcoholic match for people that wanted to have some drinks, which used Swedish fruits and stuff. But then I had an entire non-alcoholic pairing that I had to do with only things from the square and from foraging. And so I had to use whey, and I made kombucha, but with birch sugar and lemon verbena rather than white sugar and black tea from China. And the flavours, I mean, we made a cocktail where we'd soaked the frames from Paul's honey production and the water that came off them with all the wax and the dead bees. We strained it, and that water with a pickle juice, it's one of the nicest things I've ever tasted. I would never have done that if I hadn't been restricted. So I found that was the most creative project I've ever worked on. And it's really inspiring to give yourself some parameters, because then suddenly, also we talked so much about beverage and about the plates. Normally, Paul will be in the kitchen and I'll be doing something. And then suddenly it's like, oh, I've got this, can you use it? And it does create a communication. And then when guests come, the stories are so much more interesting. So from a restaurant perspective, you're connecting with your guests in a way that you can't do if you've got imported zucchini all year round. I don't know, it's a really beautiful, the parameters I think are a real positive.
And if you when you look at it out of a whole perspective as well, then suddenly, normally you don't consider the pickle juice as part of the product. It's a juice in a jar and you pour it out and then you take the pickles. But then suddenly the pickle juice is as sort of, valuable as the actual pickles. And that's one way of looking at a product out of a 100% perspective, because when you do the fermentation, the actual liquid, for me at least, is the most valuable stuff, because it creates a beautiful sauce, it is a flavorizer for a stock, it's an emulsifier for a béarnaise. Like it's so much more than the actual fermented product. So it's also about not looking at it as a waste product. It's like a fraction of the product. So the actual use matters as much as the actual product. And that means when you look at it, not just, as I said, it's not, I don't consider anything really garbage until it's moldy or impossible to eat, of course. But at the same time, that gives you a reason to think outside the box as well. So when you look at an eggshell, for an example, of course, that could be a healthy product for your farm. But it's also calcium. So then suddenly, when you look at it, maybe that could become part of a plate, which we did together with oyster shells and blue shells, for an example, when you live close to the Bay Area. Then suddenly, that's a waste product, of course. You carry it out in a sack and you throw it in the bin, but then if you crush it, this is a really funny story, because I figured this one out, and my head chef at that point, which were working at Fotografiska, his brother is in the building industry. And we said, how are we gonna take these oyster shells down into a powder? Because the crockery wanted a powder. So he came around with one of those, where you do the roads with. And we tried a small one, didn't work. And finally we had to have the big one, like we just poured it on the street and he just ran over it and we sweeped it up. And then that became the plates for the first sort of restaurant serving. So everything is possible to use and nothing needs to get wasted. It's just, as a friend of ours normally says in England, he has the first zero waste restaurant. He always says that waste is just a failure of imagination. And I believe that.
And we'll come over here. I heard 20 years ago when I was in Sweden, someone say, waste is what is left when your imagination runs out. And I think that you are emphasizing that so much. We'll go right here to Tom.
Thank you so much. Tom Dubois, University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I was wondering in your curriculum if you vary the different regions that you focus on. I mean, Dalarna has a long history of ethnography and it's got a very specific framework. So I'm wondering, do you choose a different region each time? And is there any region in Sweden that you would think off the hand would be particularly challenging to do?
Yeah. I would say yes on both the first questions. We've tried different regions, smaller places, bigger regions. We've had students working with different spaces inside the region and how they could connect to each other. So they learn about a specific place, but also what they are lacking and how we connect those different kinds of regions together to create different dishes so they could lend from each other, like in some sort of collective sufficiency, sort of. That we've tried, but also sort of your final question is about if the further up north you go, the harsher it gets, of course. And the growth zone, which Christopher comes from, is really hard. Like a vegetable season is really short. That demands different sort of aspects of agriculture. But they have different aspects of nature, of course. The wilderness, they have spaces, of course, for reindeers, which are living out of what the nature can provide us with. So you have aspects, and of course, we talk a lot about self-sufficiency nowadays in Sweden because it's an issue, and out of a crisis perspective, we also look at, you know, are we actually going to take care of the country? But the interesting part about it is, like, we are not anymore separate places, you know, being self-sufficient. So it's just a matter of figuring out what a region is, connected to a different region, connected to a nation, connected in a global system. And I think this tool is part of that. It could be like a reasonable tool to actually investigate a country, a region, a small place, the whole of it, and see how we could connect and also share sort of in an equal way the resources we actually have together. So starting by the global perspective, as I started, I think it's very important because I don't want to steal resources from you guys. You have more, of course. It's a better region. But it's the same thing when we went to Colombia. They only use 20% of what they produce. So they have an overproduction of produce because they have so many different growth zones. They have a long, very long season of everything, sort of, in a way. So of course it's not fair in a way, depending on where you live in the world. But it's interesting to see that this is the share we have. And if we could work inside this framework, that leaves a lot more for other people that actually don't have anything. So it's also about equality, sort of, in a way, when I look at gastronomy nowadays, that I need to stay inside the framework because I know how to. That leaves some room for someone else that doesn't do it at this point. But hopefully, in a close by future, people get more aware, and we're moving towards a more equal share of the produce we can produce.
Hi. I also live in Emeryville with him. Liana Rödegård. I lived in Västerås from 1978 to 1981, and I came from the New York region. I never saw an avocado. Mm-hmm. I never saw a lime. So I know a lot has changed in Sweden over the years. I was wondering if you could comment on the climate change and how it's affecting the agriculture in Sweden.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar, I think, to most other countries. We have today, I think it's 10% of all the production in Sweden is organic, and 90% is conventional, of course. That means we have every second, every third year, we have a crop situation because they're not adapted to the climate change that we are moving into, which is a huge problem, of course, for the farmers. But also there's shifts, of course, which is good in one way and it's bad in another way. But we actually have a nice production of wine in the south of Sweden, and one of the wine producers is a really good friend of mine. He's been doing it for 30 years now, and he told me just when he started it was a huge hassle. It was almost impossible to do a good wine because the season is too short. But now suddenly, looking at a 25 years period, they are going out of 4 months of summer season to 5 months. So that's one perspective of, like, it's of course even better to grow food in the south of Sweden nowadays because they have a longer summer season. So that's a positive and a negative, sort of, at the same time, perspective of the climate changes. But the awareness in Sweden is growing, which also is sort of connected to, I mean, the crisis perspective. And also when because I work in a regenerative garden with the restaurant, So we are talking a lot about, being prepared for a different kind of climate and what kind of crops. And that's the interesting part about it, because until now we just grow. We call it cucumber, or we call it zucchini, or we call it whatever. But it's like an enormous variety of crops, of course. And we've left what you call F1, like the hybrids, and going just all the way into heritage sort of seeds, but also looking at our own seed production, because, I'm not an expert in this area, but it makes sense to say a seed that is programmed, an organic seed is programmed for an organic soil. But a conventional seed is not programmed for an organic soil, so if you put a conventional seed in there, it's not going to find its way. It's just going to get confused. So it's also about adapting the seed to the soil and adapting it to that climate and that area and that regional perspective of what actually could become a very flavor-intense product, but also a good yield. But a yield for me is not just the crop, it's like how much of a crop you could actually eat. So coming out of that, we look at a cauliflower like a cabbage and not as a flower. And that's an interesting part, because we don't eat cabbage out of cauliflower, we just eat the flower. So maybe 60% out of the actual crop is not consumed. But it actually is a cabbage, where we just got to learn the actual flower. So that's also a perspective of sort of showcasing there's more to a product, also out of a yield perspective, and not having enough arable land to produce food to everyone. So it's also about being efficient with that space. So that's also something we're looking at. Because of the climate change, we need to be more precise in what kind of crop we actually are growing to be more resilient over time.
I think the other thing with climate change that has been experienced a lot in Sweden in the last 5 years is drought.
Yeah.
It's a huge change there in the lack of water, and that ties again into the seeds and the soil health that's being created. So a 90% production of conventional crops that don't have deep roots, don't have strong bases, can't survive challenging environments. No. The drought is bad for the food production, but then the plants that are being grown aren't resilient to that situation either. And so I think there's this spider's web of challenges to try and build a system that creates a healthy soil with a healthy product that, whether it rains or not, is actually going to be reasonably okay. But at the moment, it just crumbles the minute it doesn't rain for 2 weeks.
And that's why I was so inspired the first time I was here. That's 10, maybe 12 years ago, when I went to this restaurant, the Perennials, because that's something we talk a lot about. And I have a good example in my garden, actually. I have an ocean cabbage, or sea cabbage, which is the sort of heritage cabbage, which all cabbage comes out of. But the amazing stuff with this cabbage is it's tastier than normal kale. It looks something in between, like a white cabbage and a kale. So it's like flat leaves. Comes every year. You don't need to nurse it. It just regrows. And it becomes larger every year and becomes tastier and more intense every year. I've had it now for 4 years. And now it was like this tiny little thing that we put in the soil 5 years ago, and now it's a big bush. So actually it's stupid to just grow kale nowadays, because I have so much already. And this is something I don't need to nurse. It is sort of adapted to my soil. It's adapted to the climate. It just continues to flourish. So it's also about the perspective of perennials, which is really interesting, which we are moving into now in the garden, because we don't have enough. We have a beautiful fruit garden and all that sort of stuff, but when you look at the agriculture perspective, there's so much more to it. And in the heritage is a lot of the answers, because most of these products are perennial to begin with. We've just changed that system. So I think that's also something to be really looking out for, the perennial food, sort of, in a way. Sorry? Ocean cabbage, or sea cabbage, I think.
It's delicious.
Yeah, it's super delicious. And it has a very long season. It starts already, at least in Sweden. The season starts in April and continues till there. I just left home a few days ago. It's still flourishing. So it's like a harvest season over 8 months or something. It's a beautiful crop.
My name's Ted Olson from San Francisco.
Nice to meet you.
I wonder, what kind of dishes have you prepared made of insects? The reason I'm mentioning this is, here's a category we don't think of breeding, and we could create such huge crops of those kinds of things, as we could also do in cities, similar to Singapore, of growing vines down these huge skyscrapers and stuff like that. Lots of alternatives, as you've been teaching us.
Yeah. Now, I've tried a lot. There was a period of time, actually the same period of time I was here the first time, because we did a journey. I had a mission to it was actually a company that wanted to investigate where is sort of, you know, the future of food at this point. And one of that perspectives was the insects, and mainly because Mexico, for an example, has a very sort of big variety of insects, and it's part of their culture. They eat it every day, and it comes in so many different varieties and forms. And I was super interested because we don't have that culture at all. People find it, terrible, scary. So there was a time where people investigated now, and it's moved into becoming fodder. So I actually tried just a year ago, I tried the first salmon breeded on insects instead of bred on fish. And it was super tasty. And of course, it's a predator. It wants other animal products. So this was a project with SLU. I know it's the Agriculture University of Sweden. And they had a small project. They are now scaling it to see if it's possible. And it's insects in Sweden which grow quite rapidly and doesn't need heat, because that's the normal perspective. And then you have the energy situation when you need to heat up something to grow insects. So to do it sustainable in Sweden, it needs to be like a cold sort of based insect in a way. But that's very successful. So that's one side of it. The other side is, of course, it's protein. And it's been that protein sort of discussion for so many years now. And I think most boys and men in Sweden are so concerned that they're going to get undernutrient by protein, which is not the case. But still, all the supplements for gyms and all that sort of stuff has been looking really hard into the insects perspective of making powders, making bars. So I think there is a future for it, and I think most, in the Nordic countries at least, they look at it out of fodder perspective. So there's also the perspective of connection in between the ocean and the insects, and they have a really cool project, or had, I'm not sure if it's continued, but it's a really cool project with livestock actually. So they tried on beef cattle a year ago, connecting a red algae, which is very high density of protein, with insects as a fodder for 3 months, I think. And they didn't like it to begin with, but it took some time to get them used to it. But the upside of it was that they didn't fart, and they didn't what do you say?
Produce methane.
Yeah, they didn't produce any methane gas during that time. So it was suddenly neutral in a way, neutral livestock. So that was interesting as well, as, looking at a product in a different way. So instead of saying it's bad with livestock, because it's not really, we need it, but maybe the amount of livestock we have and the amount of arable land we are using just to produce fodder for them, that's an interesting part about it. And I mean, algae, for me at least, is probably the most interesting part about it. And it made me so happy someone said that seaweed is like a large thing here in the Bay Area, because I see such a potential in seaweed, mainly because it's really tasty, of course, but also the ability to transform in so many different ways, like biomass. It could be plastic, it could be clothes, it could be fuel, it could be anything really. And also it combines carbon dioxide 5 times as much as forests. So any algae farm there is out there is good for us, all of us, even though we don't eat it, if you just consume it as a biomass. So I'm really looking forward to all the tech perspective of algae, actually. I'm part of a little small firm in Sweden called Nordic Sea Farm. They're really into it. They are sort of a startup still. They've been there for 10 years, but they are slowly moving in to becoming a relevant product on the markets.
We have time for one more question. Is there one more question here? Please, and if you'd kindly say who you are and where you're coming from.
Hi, my name is Zach Brown. I am a graduate student here at the Public Policy School. I also worked in fine dining restaurants for the last 4 years, so I'm familiar with your world. I think it's really cool that you're focused on no-waste cooking in your cuisine. But to go back to your point about equality earlier, a lot of the no-waste techniques take a lot of labor and result in food that's beautiful and delicious, but only available at a high price point. Where do you see food like this and no-waste techniques becoming more accessible to a wider audience in the future?
I think I have a few good examples. I mean, I totally agree with you. It's a process of peeling, preserving, pureeing, making beautiful flans and all sorts of stuff out of, what you normally wouldn't eat. But the simple answer is it's really tasty to make a beer out of wasted bread. So that could become the beverage, like we did a lot at the restaurant. That's an easy process. And the interesting part about it, it actually produces another biostream, which is full of fibers. And then suddenly that is an additional to the bread, which also makes the bread more healthy. You are sort of adding more fibers to the bread every single time you do that circular procedure with a beer. But also a very simple thing is to create a natural process. I always say that because otherwise it becomes too expensive. So a simple answer is we make bread out of bread. That's the easiest way to do it. So we have this beautiful wood-fired bakery at the premises. And we bake bread every day, and we offer bread for lunch, and we have bread in every single way in the restaurant. We know for sure that we're going to have leftover bread. That's for sure. There's never a day where we don't have leftover bread. So that's a process that we need to sort of include in the whole sort of area of all the staff. It could be up to 100 people. So everyone knows that every leftover slice of bread needs to go on the oven every night. And the first thing someone do in the morning is to grate all that bread. So we have a huge machine just for grating. It takes 2 minutes to do that. And then the bakery know they're going to pick up every day. They don't use everything every day, but they are picking up every day. So that makes a process of maybe 4 people involved. But it also makes sure that the bread goes back into the bread every day. And depending on the amount of bread we bake, sometimes we have a lot, sometimes we don't. Then suddenly we have to also redo the recipe. So if we don't have a leftover bread, then suddenly we're in a different position. So we can't create waste to produce a waste product. So it's also about being agile sort of in a way with the process. And you need to think it through before you start it. And if there's no process, then it becomes really expensive. That's the thing. So to be agile sort of in a way where you change products every day and what to do with this and what to do with that, that's a difficult perspective of handling waste. But in a bigger perspective, I think it's not more expensive. It actually is cheaper in a way if it's a big process of just collecting something that people normally don't use. Like, for an example, garum has become a huge thing, at least in Europe at this point. It's the Asian version of stock, but it's really fermented leftovers. It always is. Fish sauce everyone knows about. It's the inside of a fish, it's the skin of the fish, it's the head of the fish. Same thing goes for vegetables. So if we have a huge garum process of making it in Sweden, then suddenly there's a craving for a product that we would normally throw away. So it's also about what kind of product is the easy way in to actually emphasize, but also to be very productive in an easy way. So for us, at least, we're looking at creating our own different kinds of garums instead of getting stock in.
If I can, just one thing on that note. on the sort of accessibility and price point that you were asking about, I'm really passionate about this. I think sustainable lifestyle, whether it's organic food or an electric car, people are priced out of it, and you feel like you can't have ownership over trying to be better because of the price point. And I think the challenge often is that the restaurants and the chefs that have the time and the inclination to be innovative often own those restaurants that have a higher price point. But the restaurant that Paul and I owned, Paul Taylor Lanthandle, was a very small neighbourhood restaurant, 50 seats, people came in for a plate at lunchtime with a piece of bread. It was not a fine dining restaurant, it was a community space. And I think sometimes we need to try and get more people to do smaller things rather than 10 chefs in Sweden to do these very elaborate menus where you need 8 stagiaires to pick 700 types of herbs.
Yeah.
So I think there is a different...
tweezer.
With the tweezer, no tweezers. So I think we just need to try and create a different model to make it accessible for people, so that whether you're going out for your anniversary dinner with your husband and you want to go and spend 2,000 crowns on dinner, good on you, it will be delicious. You should also be able to spend 120 crowns on lunch and have something that's doing something good. And I think that's a cultural shift, that's a storytelling moment, that's being in rooms like this and discussing it. I think there's so much room there. There is a gap. We need to talk about it more and make it easier for people.
And to close that gap.
Exactly.
Okay, on that note, I think we're going to take a moment to thank Paul and Ruth and move to our coffee break over here.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Namaste.